And we're live with Angular Air. Hello, I'm your host, Kent C. Dodds, and I'm happy to be here. So we are going to be talking about Angular UIRouter, which is pretty much the de facto standard for routing in Angular applications. And we have two experts here with us, Nate Silver and Chris Thane. Say hi, guys.
Hey.
Hi.
Nate Silver.
And we'll have
that. That's a compliment.
Oh, is it not Silver? That's what it is in my notes.
No, Nate Silver's the really smart, famous guy.
Oh,
I should have taken out all the trolls before we.
Oh my gosh. Jeff, I'm never going to trust this Google Doc again. Okay, so anyway, we have Troll Whelpley with us.
Hello.
AKA Jeff. And we have Amy Knight.
Hello.
And Olivier Combe.
Hi, guys.
And Patrick JS.
Hey, guys.
And so before we get started, I just have a couple of quick announcements. So for next week's show, we're going to be doing Angular fundamentals with the Angular Air panel. So it'll just be us panelists talking about the fundamentals of Angular, like difference between a provider, service factory, value constant, all that really fun, awesome stuff that we sometimes take for granted. And don't forget to ask us questions on Twitter with the hashtag NGAirQuestion. You can ask those live, and at the end of the show, we will answer them. And then follow us on Twitter and Google+ to keep up with the latest and greatest. So I'm going to turn the time over to Nate and Chris to go ahead and introduce themselves a little bit before we get into our main stuff. So why don't we have you go first, Nate?
Oh boy. All right. So my name is Nate Abley, and I've been working on UIRouter pretty much since the beginning. I wasn't the original author, but I took over pretty much when he left, and Chris and I have been hacking on it ever since. Yeah, I don't know. Well, what am I supposed to Should I tell you what my hobbies are?
Sure. Where do you work, or what do you do? Yeah.
I usually work either right here where we are now or on my couch. I have a consulting firm with some friends around the world, and we take really just all kinds of different projects and basically use all the money to be a lab for fun and interesting stuff and contributing to open source. So yeah.
Love
hey, Chris,
it.
you go now.
All right. Actually, that's the first time I think I've ever heard you say your last name out loud, and that's not how I thought it was in my head. My name is Chris Thielen.
It's okay. Everybody gets it wrong.
Yeah. I started with the UIRouter project about a year and a half ago. I started hacking on a add-on to UIRouter. It's called UIRouter Extras, and about 6 months after that, they invited me onto the team, so I've been on the UIRouter team for about a year now. I work for a company called Virtuwell in St. Paul, Minnesota, and they do 24/7 online healthcare. So you can call them up and do an online interview, and they'll give you a treatment plan.
Great. Thank you for your quick intros, and thank you for your contributions to the world and to open source. So let's go ahead and talk about those contributions here with UIRouter. So there are people who are watching who may not be familiar with UIRouter and why it's so great. So could one of you give us, maybe Nate, could you give us an intro to what UIRouter is and why we love it so much?
Sure. So UIRouter is a state machine that allows you to model your user interface and bind it to URL templates like routes. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I don't know, should we start talking about how it differs from the core router in Angular?
Yeah, you made it sound so easy.
I try. I do try. Yeah, I mean, in concept it's really simple, but that sort of model and the fact that a state machine is at the core of it, which I know you want to get into later on, is like a really rich model to do really sophisticated things. And that, in my mind, is what sets it apart from the core router in Angular 1x and 2x. But initially, we kind of set about to do it because NGRoute obviously was, lacking in some pretty significant ways. Like you couldn't do any, hierarchical routing or views, and it's generally just not very expressive. So we, tried to do something a little bit better, and I guess people liked it.
Since you bring up the state machine, can you get into a little bit of details of like what is a state machine, like specifically, and how it's used in Angular?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Chris, did you have anything to add to what I just said? Because I'm sure I'm like forgetting a ton of stuff.
Yeah. Well, like one of the things that you touched on is that UIRouter allows nested views, and I think that's really a key feature of UIRouter, and not just that we can nest views, but that the states that are controlling those views are also nested, and so you can build your application as a tree of states, of nested states, and the deepest portions of your application can inherit a bunch of behaviors and business logic from their parent states, and I think that's one of the things that really sets UIRouter apart.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely use UIRouter. I recommend people use UIRouter over NGRoute because it can do everything NGRoute can, and then some. So yeah, that's awesome.
You are my new best friend.
Sweet.
Yeah. So Jeff, you asked me to talk a little bit about state machines. A state machine is basically a way to describe like different states that a system can be in. So a really simple example is like a light switch that has, an on state and an off state, or like a car that has, park, drive, reverse, neutral, and different gears. So that's kind of like the static description of the system. And then you can, chessboard, probably also a good one. Thank you, Patrick. And then once you have kind of the all possible states that the system can be in described, you can describe transitions, which basically says what happens when you move from one to the other. Now, in like a formal finite state machine, you have to describe all those transitions up front. So it's like shift up means going from neutral to first gear, or first gear to second gear, and stuff like that. That's obviously not super useful in when you're modeling a UI where people can kind of move around freely. And this is actually one of the things that we kind of missed the boat on the first time around that we've now addressed in UIRouter 1.0, is kind of like surfacing those transitions as like a first-class thing. Because currently, like, okay, you have all your states, and then, on transitions between certain groups of states, you'll like want something specific to happen. Right now, people will use like these global events for triggering, state change start or state change end, and kind of like using that as a switchboard for, global system logic. And so in 1.0 now we have a system where you can say, okay, for this group of states and this group of states, any transition from one set to the other set, we want this specific thing to happen. So it's a really, really sophisticated way of not only describing an application, but describing what happens as the user moves through it.
Yeah, and in addition to that, when you're describing your application via these hierarchical states, one of the things that you can do is you can declaratively state the kind of data that each element of your application requires, and those are the resolves essentially. And using those resolves, you can inject that data into your views in a manner that doesn't tie your view necessarily directly to the mechanism for retrieval or even the mechanism for injection. In addition to that, because of our hierarchical capabilities in the states, a substate can also inject data that's declared on like a parent state, for instance. And that ability allows you to describe your application in a way that helps improve code quality and reuse.
Yeah, I totally recommend that anybody watching this who uses the router, or who doesn't use the router, first use the router, and then make sure that you're using resolves. It cleans up your code so much. So yeah, highly recommended. So actually, one thing that I guess I'll just bring up is you mentioned how in Angular or in the 1.0 version, it's easier to like have some action performed with a group as the user navigates to like a group of routes or something.
Right.
And I can tell you from my experience, like I'm looking forward to seeing what that's like, because using the events can be a little bit hairy, and like for example, setting up authentication, so you have this half of your app is authenticated, this half is not. That can be a real pain in the rear when you're trying to decide like how to route the user. And like when you're developing it, if you haven't gotten it set up, like your browser can go crazy, because it's like, oh, I want you to go here, now you're going to go here, now you're going to go here, and you get into this loop of routing that's just like, it's total insanity and craziness. It can be a real pain sometimes.
I completely agree, and that's definitely one of the use cases that we were accounting for when we redesigned UIRouter in 1.0 with the new transition hooks. In the past, what people would do is they would either hook into the state change events, as Nate mentioned, or they would hook into things like an on-enter callback, or perhaps even a resolve, in trying to manage things like locking down authenticated trees of an application. It causes difficulties for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that in the state change events, you don't actually have access to most of your data. You have access to the state parameters, which are typically parsed out of the URL. That would be like a, let's say if you're editing books, that would be a book ID in the editor. You might have some logic in your app that says if they're trying to edit a book, well, they need to be authenticated and have a certain role. One of the problems is that you may need to fetch that authentication information on the fly, and that's really difficult to do in the existing UIRouter using the state change events. You can do it with like a resolve, perhaps, but then you don't have access to some of the things that you might have access to in the state change event, such as where did I come from, which state did I come from, which state did I go to. So in 1.0, part of our refactoring is that we have kind of consolidated those two concepts into a single concept, and that's a transition hook. And in the transition hook, you have access to the entire life cycle of the transition, so you can hook into it at the same point that you would have in the past using the events, but you also have access to all the resolved data, and you have a fully fledged API for doing redirects if that's what you need to do. So you could, for instance, redirect to a login state.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that can be asynchronous as well. So I could go check, like, say I have the user token on the client, and I say I need to validate that this token is still valid. I can asynchronously do that. Okay.
Yep.
And so what does the user see at that time? Like, do I have to say this is what the user sees during the time that I'm doing this async thing, or do they just stay where they were before, or?
That would
So
be.
we're
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, I was going to say, so the one really cool thing that I'm familiar with in the Ember router is that they have this concept of called pivot states, and that's something that we're definitely interested in providing, like as a way of presenting the user something that they can look at while this transition is happening. And I mean, you can already kind of simulate that with like just defining an intermediate state, or what have you. We don't really like. We don't prevent you from doing that, but we don't provide a specific way to do that. Yeah, so it's definitely something that we're looking into.
And it's one thing that you can implement even in the current system. You could implement, like, let's say, a spinner or a loading bar or something to that effect. You can do that currently with the state change events. Essentially, when the state change starts, you would turn on a spinner, and let's say theoretically, the current version, not the 1.0, would allow you to do an asynchronous lookup. When that's all done, when the state change is succeeded or failed, then you could turn off that spinner. In the new API, you can still do that. You just don't use events. So you can have some sort of a global, hey, the state is transitioning, we're not there yet, we're fetching data, all that kind of stuff, and you can display something to the end user.
Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as like just, oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was going to say that once we get past the 1.0 version, one of the things that Nate and I have been discussing is progressive rendering of nested views. So like we would like to be able to turn on a view when the state is entered asynchronously, even if the entire transition to the deepest state in the state tree has not yet been completed.
So that would be like I have some deeply nested resolve statement, and so I load everything except for that deeply nested state until like that gets that resolve finishes, and so you kind of compile pieces. Is that what you mean?
That's pretty close to what I mean. Nate, were you going to make a comment on something else before we move on?
Oh, yeah, I think I was just going to say, like, in the new hook system, you can return promises that block on, waiting for those authentication tokens and things like that. But yeah, we've been talking about, so in the core, Chris completely tore out and rewrote the whole resolve system such that we can have different resolve policies, and that allows us to do that kind of progressive rendering. And one thing that I'm even working towards is being able to show templates before, like, the resolves for a controller have even finished loading. So like if you're on Facebook on a really slow connection, like it'll pop up that empty template for a story like immediately, and then as the data is loading in, it'll fill in the template. So it really gives the user like this really fluid experience of, okay, the structure is already there and things are just kind of like fading in as the data is available.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
We've been talking quite a bit about nested state trees, and I wanted to give maybe a more concrete example of what a nested state tree might be. Let's say you have an application that is some sort of an editor for a company directory or something that you can drill down through like organizations in a company, maybe manager, state, and maybe a list of employees, and then drill down into an employee. That would be a series of nested states, potentially. The top level state might be something like company. A state below that might be something like company dot organization. Below that might be company dot organization dot manager, and then dot employees, and then dot employees. So you're kind of drilling down into a hierarchical structure. You've modeled your application against this hierarchical structure, and you can transition to any point in that hierarchy using like a transition command. So you transition to company.organization A dot manager 123 dot employee list, for instance. That might be your state. At each level, you can set up a resolve that would load the data necessary to show that state in your application. And UIRouter is going to handle loading of all the data and passing it down into each nested substate that requires it. And like Nate was saying, it's all asynchronous now. We have these resolve policies. So if you have a piece of data declared on a top level state, what it's going to do is it's going to wait until something actually injects that data before it fetches that resolve, and that's called just-in-time resolve policy. We also have a lazy one that's used when a state is being entered. So we would wait until we get down to, let's say, the employer, the manager state, before we fetch the resolve data that the manager state requires, even if we're coming all the way from the root application down to this very deeply nested state. And finally, we have one that's called eager, and eager happens at the beginning of the state transition. So that's what the current UIRouter resolves are, essentially an eager policy resolve. So what that means is if you ask the state machine to navigate from some unrelated state all the way down to this deeply nested employee state, it's going to fetch all the data that all of those nested substates require before it even starts that transition. So that's what we're calling an eager resolve. So by combining these resolve policies and utilizing them in your application, you can declare like the behavior that you would like for a specific transition. One thing that you could do is you could put your auth your auth resolve, for instance, as a eager resolve, and then it's going to validate that your auth is successful before it even starts the transition. It's going to do the asynchronous operations, check the result of that, say, hey, are they authorized? If so, then it's going to begin the rest of the transition. If you have things like data set at lazy at each of the states in your application, like eager policy, like at the employee or manager level, then it's going to fetch those right before it enters that state. So with these policies, we can kind of customize the data loading behavior for each use case that you're trying to implement.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
I mean, we've really spent a lot of time overall just thinking about the user experience that people are going to have when they use UIRouter applications, and the ability for the developer to really tune that user experience in a really specific way. And that and templates are just a couple of examples.
Cool. So with these different policies, I'm curious, two questions. What does the API look like? How's the API changing for me to declare my resolve policy? And what's the default?
We're still working out. So, well, Chris, you can probably address this, but you'll probably stick the policy somewhere in the resolve block. Resolves basically look the same as they do in the current UIRouter. And yeah, so you'll just assign a policy somewhere in the block.
Yeah, so currently we've got the default resolve policy set to just in time, which means all of your resolves are now extremely, extremely lazy. They don't actually even fetch until they're injected somewhere. So for instance, if you had an auth resolve and you don't inject it anywhere, it's never going to get validated. So I think we might change that default policy to lazy, because I think that's going to have the less surprise for our existing users. But we're definitely going to turn the default away from eager, where it is in current UIRouter. As far as for the way that you configure the resolve policies on a resolve, right now we have a separate, as a peer to the resolve declaration in a state object, we also have a resolve policy that can be either a string or an object. If it's an object, it references the named resolves that are in your current state. If it's a string, it sets the resolve policy for all the resolves in that state.
So which one would you use to lazy load code with OC lazy load, for example?
If you wanted to do that, you would definitely use an eager resolve, because you want that to happen before the state enters.
Okay.
Now
So
you actually oh, go ahead, Ken.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay.
I'll go ahead. So this is kind of related. So I was just kind of as a tip, fellow library author. So one thing in Angular formally, we have this concept of validators, and it's an object where the key is the name of the validator, the value is the validator itself. But when implementing messages, you can have like some generic messages, but then you can have a specific message for that validator, like an error message. And so I kind of toyed with the idea of having a separate object that mapped to the same validator, but I decided to go with something a little different. So now, if you want, you can do the same thing where the key is the name of the validator, and then the value is a function or an expression of some kind. But if you want to add a message, then the value is no longer a function, but now it's an object that has an expression property, and that's where the function goes, and a message property, and that's where the message goes. And so you have your expression or your validator function and your message right next to each other. It's very easy. Like, it's easy to look at that code and understand without having to reference somewhere else. And then it also makes for easier reusability, so you can kind of compose validators together. So maybe something like that would be helpful for UIRouter when defining your policies.
That's kind of the direction that I was heading in. Like, I mean, we really just kind of threw out this API like last week or something. I think like was the first time we even surfaced it in like an end user accessible thing. Yeah, I want to go a little bit more in that direction also, just for the sake of like less repetition. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we're still evolving it.
Yeah, we're hoping to release an alpha version very shortly. I'm going to make sure that 1.0 works at my day job's app, and after that, I'd like to get the alpha release out there, get the community to look at it and give us some feedback, tell us where it breaks their apps, that kind of stuff, and then we'll get the API completely solid. We'll release one or two betas, and then we'll release the final 1.0.
Can you tell that Chris is the responsible one?
It's obvious. You look responsible too, Nate.
Don't let looks deceive you. So yeah,
Awesome.
that's our plan for getting that out the door. Any other questions? A release date?
I'll turn this over to the panelists now.
Alrighty.
Okay, so one question that I had, other than the fact that the Angular team is using TypeScript, what was kind of your decision into using that? It's like popular subject here, so.
Sure. I mean, it was kind of like I think Chris and I each arrived at it kind of independently, maybe. So I'll talk about the things that I liked, and Chris, you can talk about things that you liked.
Mm-hmm.
So I just can't write ES5 anymore. I just can't do it. Like my brain has switched over to ES6. So in terms of that, like we were going to use something to transpile because like I just can't write ES5 anymore. It's just that part of my life is over. And I also wanted. I was kind of really drawn to the idea of doing something that is strongly typed and migrating the code base over to take advantage more of classes and stuff. So it was either going to be something like TypeScript or something like Flow. And I think we just decided to go with TypeScript because like the Angular team was already doing it, and that's seemed to be the direction that everybody in the community was kind of moving in as a result. And it's kind of like either or. I think like my ideal scenario would be if TypeScript kind of threw away their infrastructure and rebuilt on top of Babel, because like my experience with Babel in terms of like build tooling has definitely been better, but really they're not that different. I don't know. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think we both kind of came to the conclusion that we wanted to leave ES5 in the dust, get up to at least ES6, and it was like, do we want to do ES6 or do we want to do TypeScript? I think that was our conversation at the time. And I started toying with TypeScript, and I come from a Java background, so I have an affinity for strongly typed code. I really like the ability to refactor and be confident about my refactors. So I started adding in some typing annotations, and I converted our build tooling to TypeScript, and I liked what I saw, and so that's we kind of bit the bullet, and we've converted most of the code base at this point.
Yeah, at that point, like IntelliSense, like little pop-ups started showing up in Sublime, and I'm like, this is amazing! I haven't seen this in years, and that's like, yeah, I was totally sold at that point.
Okay, so my next question, I think I read in one of your GitHub threads that long-term you kind of envision UIRouter not being tied to Angular, so it would work with Angular 1, Angular 2, and then maybe even React. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
That's a lie. You read that nowhere. No, I don't remember really talking about it publicly, but yeah, Chris and I were just kind of chatting one time, and we were like, the core of this thing is, just a really good generic, state machine for managing UIs, and that's not really specific to any framework. And we kind of had the idea that, well, the whole thing about Angular 2 is supposed to be decoupled, generic JavaScript libraries. So we were like, well, we could do that, and that would be an easy way to support Angular 1 and 2 and maybe some other stuff. I know other people in the Angular and like high-level JavaScript community have pinged me about like, frustrations with React Router and things that they don't like about that. And I was like, well, we were thinking about this thing, and they're like, yeah, you totally should. So it just kind of grew from there. Yeah, and yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
I think at the core of that discussion, we talked about what pieces are we actually tied to Angular 1 for. And there's not really that many things that we specifically use that are Angular technologies. We use like location service, and we use the injector. And so what we've started to do is we've started to divorce ourselves from the injector, which is going to be a feat. The other thing, pretty big component that we're going to have to consider is how we do our rendering of views. Because that's definitely tied to existing controller infrastructure and just the way that Angular handles DOM. But we're definitely targeting NG2 as one of our platforms. In order to do that, we're going to have to divorce ourselves from all of the Angular 1 services. Once we've done that, I think we'll have a pretty portable piece of code that the view system can be pluggable.
Yeah, actually, if you want to talk with Jason Debris about pulling out Angular out of your project, we had him on the show a while ago. He is the author of what once was Angular Data and now is called JS Data. And basically, he has like a 100-line file that just adds up as a plugin for JS Data that interops with Angular, and it's awesome. I use it and I love it. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic thing to do. I've been meaning to see if I can figure out a way to do that with Angular Formally, but Angular Formally, like I don't know how I could pull Angular out of that.
Yeah. That's pretty tough.
Yeah. So, but that's cool. I think that's good that you're doing that.
So, if you're evolving this way, do you have any ideas on how UIRouter will evolve after the component router is out? Did you look at the functionalities and decided to pick some things because it was cool?
So the audio was a little bit scratchy, but it sounded like you're talking about like, what's our plan post 1.0, and if we've drawn any inspiration from the component router. Is that about right?
Yes, it was that.
All right. I don't know. Have we drawn inspiration from a component router? Other than everybody saying you guys need to support components in addition to controllers, I don't think so. I mean, I remember looking at some of the internals and kind of the stuff they were doing with their like transition pipeline, and I think we were already kind of heading in that same direction. So like, I don't know, how long ago was it, Chris, when I started hacking on the new code base? Like a year or something?
Oh, it's been more. It's been a year and a half, 2 years.
Jeez, that's terrible.
Yeah.
So I started working on UIRouter, what is now UIRouter 1.0, about a year and a half ago. And my two main goals were like to decouple the view system from the state machine. So essentially you could have like a way to manage views across an application that was just like a service, like a view service that's you could just use as an independent consumer. And that is also going to play really heavily into our plans for the future. And then the other part was having this pipeline of operations where that would allow the process of doing a transition to be fully atomic. A lot of the problems with the current router's design is that it uses a lot of globals, and operations happen in kind of a destructive way. That just makes architectural things really difficult and painful for us, and anybody who's using UIRouter. So those are kind of the two problems that we've set out to solve. I think we have, and it seems like some of the stuff that Component Router is doing with its pipeline is, they arrived at a similar place. So that's kind of like it's kind of a relief that like smart people are doing similar things. I don't think we specifically drew any inspiration from them, at least not that I recall. I mean, initially we were kind of like working with the core team on their, the design document for the new router pretty early on. And then kind of the big point that we differed on was using a state machine. That's kind of like central for us for, reasons that we've described, and other reasons that I can go on and on at length about. But they felt that like it was a little too complex for like the general Angular population. So that's kind of how they ended up going in that direction.
So there's this difference in philosophy, right? Where the UI router, based on states, and the component router based off essentially URLs, right? Everything is URL driven.
Right.
So is there anything that, or what can you think of that is difficult to accomplish using the component router approach that is, easier, more straightforward to accomplish with the state machine approach?
Sure. I'm going to try really hard not to sound like I'm criticizing anybody, because I mean, I think the component router has a lot of really cool things going for it, and it's not that I think that like we're better or whatever. It's just I'm partial to our approach, and Chris is too. I'm speaking for you, Chris.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, like so streams in Angular 2 are like being presented as kind of a big deal, right? Because they're like this ideal primitive for dealing with a particular problem domain of like asynchronous data and events, arrays, and promises, like all kind of can be modeled in this way that provides certain guarantees and allows you to think about it at a higher level of abstraction. So it's like this ideal primitive that you can build other things on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So so we feel essentially that like a hierarchical state machine with these really expressive transitions is kind of like that same ideal primitive for modeling sophisticated UIs. And it's kind of like this is in some ways kind of embarrassing for me being on, but I used to do a lot of PHP. I still do a lot of PHP. So I was the lead developer of Cake PHP for a while, if anybody's ever heard of that. And we did this thing called has and belongs to many, or like has many through, or whatever if you do Rails. And that was always one of the like most painful parts of the framework to like maintain and do stuff with, because really that like has and belongs to many relationship, you're burying this second relationship kind of in the configuration between one relationship. So it's really there's this other idea that you kind of have to like extract out and bring to the surface so that you can reason about it effectively. And that's kind of what I kind of feel the same way about trying to tie template and controller and resolve configurations directly to URLs. Most people have very sophisticated, complicated UIs that have a lot of different states, and not all of them map to URLs. And some people write apps with no URLs at all. So it's like states give you this very not only an expressive thing because you can describe every possible thing that the UI can do, and it's also you're able to do that in a very declarative way. And then how are you going to map every single one of those to URLs? It just doesn't really make sense. And I mean, to me, it's like, I guess templating is maybe another example. Like the point of how Angular templates work is like you can talk, you can talk up to your application's design, not like down to the DOM. It acts as that buffer, that bridge. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing is that two of the biggest things that speak to me is the declarative, like that you can, in a declarative way, specify something that has, many different effects, potentially, that if you try to do it in an imperative way would require more code, be, maybe more difficult, that type of thing. But then also there are limitations with when you're depending on the URLs, like there's limitations on the URL. I mean, it's a one-dimensional thing, right? Like,
yep.
So how can you effectively serialize all these different combinations of states in a one-dimensional thing? The only thing I would say on that is that Matthias and Brian are kind of working on some ways for that specific problem. I mean, it's a tough problem, and I think some of the stuff that they're doing will help with that, but it is for sure a challenge on the kind of URL component router side of things.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're coming short on time already. This has been so much fun. I'm going to just say, panelists, if you have a couple of questions that you want to make sure that you ask them now, and then we'll go to questions. Again, anybody watching live can ask a question using the hashtag NGAirQuestion on Twitter. and we will answer those in a minute. So, panelists, do you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, so Nate, you mentioned streams. Are you referring to Rx observables or just streams in general?
The concept of streams in general, but yeah, like Rx would be kind of like, I mean, that's the implementation that I use or have started to use.
So are you suggesting that UIRouter in the future may include Rx JS?
I mean, I was just using that as an analogy, but I certainly could see a future where we move in a more stream-oriented way. And it's like everything in the 1.0 architecture is based on promises now, so you can already like wrap it in that easily. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the future holds.
Maybe.
Yeah, because like I actually had one problem with UIRouter a long time ago, where had something inside of resolve, and that kind of didn't resolve, and then it's kind of hanging. And something like with observables, you're able to cancel it. Like that would be like one benefit of canceling and then being able to like say do this or something else. Like that's like one very small like use case that I see.
Yeah, we don't have anything like that currently. Although actually, one thing we didn't even get to talk about is in this whole transition hook system, like all those like billion parameters in all of the state events have gone away completely. We now have like a first-class transition object that encapsulates all of your stuff. So yeah, we could definitely expose some kind of like API on that object that allows you to manipulate your resolves at some level to avoid stuff like that.
Sweet.
Yeah, one thing that we do allow is if you start another transition, the existing transition that's in process is canceled. It can't cancel the promise, the resolve that you initiated, but it can cancel the transition.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's some of the like that's one of the biggest benefit of like using Rx as opposed to like promises is that you don't have to like create another mechanism to cancel the promise.
Sure.
Yeah. So like, what about introducing like more syntax? Like, I don't know if you guys noticed, but someone released ng2 now, which allows someone to write kind of like Angular 2 style code in for Angular 1, and someone created an @state decorator that pretty much is the UIRouter's API, but as a decorator. Do you see you guys like implementing your own decorator and supporting that kind of syntax going forward to like Angular 2?
I just saw that. Didn't we see that somewhere, Chris?
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's the same guy, but I definitely found a link to a state decorator. That's something that I would be open to, or at least having perhaps a recipe that we publish. I think there's going to be a lot of recipes published for 1.0, stuff like this is how you can do auth, this is how you can do declarative redirects. Maybe one of those things is this is how you can create a decorator for declaring states.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing we could do is like internally states are now represented by their own class. So we could just say, oh yeah, we'll just export this class, you can import it and extend it. So that's maybe another possibility where you wouldn't even need a decorator. Yeah, I don't know. We're certainly open to all kinds of stuff like that. It's just a matter of what makes sense.
Yeah. So like one of the biggest benefits of having like the decorator is that you're able to for all your components. So this is like something like for Angular 2, where you're able to, because you declare your dependencies inside of annotation, you're able to look at that component, and then you're able to see that's dependencies. So you basically just walk down a tree, and because you're doing that, you're able to get, like, say, all the resolves, and then make a one big like batch call initially, and then that would also like help with like server rendering as well. Like this is a technique that we're doing with the Falcor integration that we found out that it's actually really nice. Basically, it's like first-class components. That's what people are calling it.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. I mean, let's take it offline. I would love to hear from you guys about that, and like if there are sort of unique advantages to taking that approach. I mean, I'm totally open to it.
Cool.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and cut us off unless there is something that one of the panelists just really needs to ask, or if our guests really want to talk about something.
I think I'll bring up one thing, maybe in response to Olivier, is that the one of the things that we would like post 1.0 to maybe have some more first-class support for is dynamically manipulating the state tree. So adding, removing states on the fly, and integrating with things like OC lazy load.
Cool. Yeah, that's actually going to be fairly straightforward to implement. I'm just an API Nazi, so I haven't come up with anything that I love for doing that.
Yeah, this would definitely be super useful.
Yeah, totally.
Sweet. If you're an API Nazi, you ought to check out API Check. That's all I'm going to say. And the lights go out again. Oh my gosh. Hold on a second.
Send me a link.
Lights. Okay, sorry about that. And I need to talk with facilities or something. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and let's double check these questions on Twitter. Our viewers are silent. And so we're going to go ahead and get into our picks and tips. And so I'm going to go from the left to the right on who I see in my Hangout. And so that means Amy is our first.
Okay, so my pick again this week is going to be the Angular remote comp, and you can use Angular Air code to get 20% off. So you should do that. You can listen to the host talk. And then my second, this is a tip. So I'm still somewhat new to programming, and I have decided to kind of start digging into some actual RFCs. And so that's my tip for someone who's a beginner. If you want to actually check the best documentation, actually dig in and read the RFCs. They're not that bad. So that's my tip.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, Chris, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I've got, so as we've been starting to implement TypeScript throughout UIRouter, a couple things that I found really useful. The first one would be Microsoft's TypeScript Playground, and that's just a on-the-fly transpiler that you can write TypeScript code into and see what the generated ES5 output is, as well as run it in your browser. The second thing is there's this NPM module called tslint, and tslint is a linter, obviously, for TypeScript, and WebStorm EAP has some really good support for tslint, and it will show you a bunch of the lint rules right in the browser.
Well, and I think they're going to be making a new one of those soon, too, so that is awesome. Okay, cool. So, Jeff, you're next.
I'll let Patrick go first.
Circumventing my authority? Sure, we'll go ahead and I'll skip ahead to Patrick, and then we'll go back to you, Jeff.
Cool. So my tip is the Angular 2 survey results. So Jeff and I, we wrote an article on, we created a survey asking developers what do they like what kind of router do they prefer. Surprise, surprise, they prefer UIRouter. I think, yeah, so you should definitely look at the results. It's on the Angular blog or on Hacker News. You can just click on the front page. And my tip is to ask questions. So just make sure you ask a lot of questions. Don't be intimidated. Just ask anyone. If you're just ask your friends, why does this not work or whatever, or I don't know. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. All right, Jeff.
Yeah, so I didn't want to step on Patrick's because I wanted to add to it. So, in doing the blog post, we were lucky enough to have Brad let us post to the Angular blog, and it made me appreciate, because they use Blogger there, it made me appreciate kind of the simplicity and beauty of Medium.com. So my plug is for Medium. I love Medium kind of even more. It's just such a simple, awesome editor for authoring kind of blog posts. And then the other thing is that we've been coming out at GetHuman with a number of kind of new sites recently and apps, And we came out with one for suggestions that you might have for other companies. So if you have any ideas for other companies, you can go to ideas.gethuman.com, and we're going to have like a whole system of trying to get people to kind of vote things up and then try to bring them to the companies to actually get some of your suggestions implemented. So you check that out at ideas.gethuman.com.
All right, I've got 2 ideas for GitHub. One, allow me to do fast forward merges so that my Git history isn't junk. And then 2, allow me to upvote issues so that I don't have a bunch of +1s all over my GitHub comments on issues. Can you
this one and this one.
There's a really good button for that. It's the one with the lock icon.
Yeah. Nice. That's great. Okay, Nate, why don't you go ahead next?
So that's one of my tips, I guess. I don't know. No, all right. So first 2 tips, real quick. Don't do destructive operations and enter exit hooks for UIRouter, because that destroys the clean atomicness of your transition. Also, I've been refactoring a lot of code and designing a lot of code with what are called value objects, which are just like simple little classes that have a little bit of behavior and don't mix any other classes in, but they're immutable using object.freeze, which is an ES6 thing. So it's like a really simple way of designing things in sort of an immutable functional way. And on that note, I have to plug Ramda.js. Everybody's heard of Lodash and underscore, and whereas those libraries claim to be for functional programming, Ramda is programming. So yeah, it's ramdajs.com, and I posted the link. Also, I posted the link to my Epic Instrumentals Spotify work playlist. So help me add more awesome songs. And I also posted the link to a thread on Hacker News, actually on the same post as the survey, where I just kind of am casually soliciting feedback on UIRouter versus component router thoughts. And then the last one is kind of a joke one. There's a game called Cube Composer, which is actually isomorphic JavaScript. And you'll see why when you click the link.
Cool. Awesome. +1 to the object.freeze, and if you are frozen back in ES5 land, you poor soul, you actually can use object.freeze. It's supported by IE9. Hooray! So,
well, I was going to say +1 for Ramda.js too.
Sweet. Awesome. I got to check that out now. Okay, sweet. Olivier, you are next on my screen.
Yes, so I have 2 things today. The first one is a blog post from Angular.js that I missed last week on Angular 1 and Angular 2, which will be able to coexist in the same application to help you move your part of Angular 1 to Angular 2 in a long time, and you don't have to rewrite your whole application. And this is really cool. I'm really happy that they decided to do that. And the other one is just that I'm looking for co-contributors on my GitHub repositories for OscillazyLoad and Angular local forage, because I don't have enough time to answer all the questions and fix all the bugs. It will be difficult for me to let my baby go, but I will have to share the custody with some people if people are interested to help me in this. Also, I will probably move to Angular 2 soon, so I won't be keeping them up to date. So yeah, if anyone is interested, just come and tell me.
Sweet. And if that was too scratchy, your audio is still a little bit scratchy, Olivier, but in case anybody is listening and it was still a little too scratchy, Olivier picked Angular 1 and 2 coexistence blog post, and that'll be in our links. And he's looking for co-contributors to OC-Lazy-Load and Angular Local Forage because he's moving to React. So, no, just kidding.
Hey.
Oh. No, because he's awesome, and you should help him with his libraries. Okay, so I am last in my screen, and my first is a tip. Write adapter wrappers for your dependencies. So if you have something that you use a lot in your app, like, for example, I have a wrapper for even Angular Formally, actually. So I'm an author of Angular Formally, but in my app, I have my own directive that simply uses Angular Formally, and that is really, really powerful. And so I have a link to a video from John Lindquist from his Pattern Craft series that he did a couple of years ago that's still totally relevant about the adapter pattern to teach you about why that's super awesome. So recommend that. And then my pick is MDN, and that's the Mozilla Developer Network. It's a terrific place to go learn about web technologies. So yeah, recommend checking that out. So great, that is all of our time and our our time together. So I'm going to wrap us up with a couple final announcements. So next week's show, same time, same place, just a week from now, on Angular fundamentals with the Angular Air panel. So it's going to be a blast and a half. We're going to talk about some very valuable knowledge that you should have about Angular. Yeah, remember to follow us on Twitter and Google+, because you should do that to keep up with the latest stuff. So yeah, I guess without any further ado, let's go ahead and say adieu. So thank you very much, Nate and Chris, for coming on the show. We really appreciate your time and appreciate your work in making the world better with Angular UIRouter. So thank you.
It's great to be here.
And
you are very welcome.
Awesome. Let's just say goodbye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Yeah.
See you next week.